Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Tacenda Capital Podcast, where we don't just follow the market's pulses, we aim to be one step ahead. Today, we are diving into the concept that money doesn't just flow randomly, it follows predictable cycles. If you understand where capital is rotating next, you can position yourself to benefit before the next big wave hits. Joining me to decode this hidden wealth building strategy is my co host, Ajay Malhotra.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Another podcast, another very interesting topic to talk about. I think most people end up working really hard, but despite the hard work, they're not able to accumulate as much wealth. Or when they accumulate the wealth, they don't know how to manage it, and they're easily able to squander it. I'll tell you a very interesting tidbit. If anybody invested in SPXL, which is Standard and Poor's 3X Bull, and I do not recommend 3X Bulls because they have so much of decay built into those ETFs. But if you would have invested about $1.80 in them in that particular ETF in 2009, today that'll be $181, right? 100x growth just by being invested in the. So, with that, I think we start this podcast. We discuss a lot of juicy tidbits, yeah, stuff like this. So, next cycle, you don't mix 100x. And this would have been the easiest 100x. And why would you get 100x? Is because government's printing and spending money, right? They're printing the money, they're putting the money. And where is the money going? The money is going to the easiest place it can flow to, market capitalization, right? Um, Wonderful.
So today's core topics, Ajay, just to reiterate for our audiences, is we're going to talk about how capital cycles work. Because if you don't understand how that works, you're never knowing when the right time to invest and when the time to exit. The other is, like you said, how does money flow? Where does it move in 2025? And of course, why the largest fortunes are being constructed before mainstream media notices. Right, most investors follow the news to invest, which is technically means you are already a few steps behind money at this point. And I think we should talk one important thing before we start off, right? There's this very common belief that wealth creation is following trends. Jump on the what's the next hottest thing. That's not true. Usually, when it becomes the next hottest thing, money has already invested in it. That's why it's become the next hottest thing. It's really about knowing when to make those predictions, where money will move so that you're actually ahead of the curve and not being the bagman.
Exactly. I agree with you. So what happens in any kind of industry is that you have smart money, and smart money is actually leading the charge. Okay, that's all about human agency. So at that point, you're not waiting for a cycle. You're not waiting on the mercy of a cycle. You're not looking at a ticker going up or a stock going up, right? What you're doing is you said, I know enough, and thereby now I am going to push the human agency further, right? So you're basically pushing civilization further. And that smart money goes ahead and starts developing cars and rockets and technology, software, SaaS, all of that, right? Now, let's go ahead and say that's the ultra smart money, right? And that ultra smart money is doing that. Then what happens next is very early on, institutional investors, large capital groups, they start getting into it, right? Because they are wining and dining these people. They know those inside secrets. And remember, everything about money is inside information, right? What you know, that is not common knowledge. Now, SEBI and SEC can go ahead and regulate that. You don't trade on insider knowledge, and that's fine, right? You should not be willfully doing something wrong against the wider market and all investors. But what's important is whenever you're taking a bet based on what you know that the other guy may not necessarily know, right? Or what you are giving a higher probability. Let's say we all know that AI is going to be the next big thing, right? Talk to some people, they say AI is already the next big thing, right? Talk to some people and they say, oh, you know what? Algorithms are going to get much smarter. And today we're looking at AI in a very narrow thing, which is a large language model. It's just working off language. But imagine everything going on AI. Just to give you input into where smart money is going, Abu Dhabi said that they'll be the first city in the world which will have AI governance. Okay. So entire city would be governed by artificial intelligence, which makes sense, right? Come think of it, right? Whether your trash got picked up, didn't get picked up, whether you somebody illegally parked in your space, whether, like there's just a million of those things which AI can handle better because it just is very capable of handling millions of parameters. Okay. So people are talking about, what AI can do, cannot do. Smart cities like Abu Dhabi are saying will go way beyond what everybody else can think. Humanoid robotics, next big angle. Nvidia, which is going beyond, is already saying, let's go ahead and look at chips that can be used for physical AI, right? For robotic movement, for working with conventional physics and things like that, right? So that's like, as I would say, ultra smart money. Now, the benefit of ultra smart money is they take a lot of 1,000x bets.
Mm-hmm.
In case of a 1,000x bet, what happens is if you lose $1. If you make $1,000, right? So your risk
Exactly.
reward ratio is very, very different. So now what happens is people go ahead and tell me, right? When I talk to people, people go ahead and say, hey, but I'm not that smart. I can't do those investments. And I'm like, I have done those investments. I've spoken to a lot of investors who've done those investments. And trust me, they all think also that they're not very smart. But the one thing that they've figured out is something called risk reward ratio. So if I'm making 1,000x bets, right? And guess, like I say, the probability in this world is 50% of the times I'm going to be right and 50% of the times I'm going to be wrong. Let's go ahead and say I'm rather stupid, right? And I would be actually right only 30% of the times. Now, if I make 100 bets, right? So, it's a question of me taking those many bets. I take 100 bets, 30 bets out of them would win. Once 30 bets win, I just made $30,000 out of the $100 invested. So it's a question of having your risk reward ratio correct and then going ahead and making those many bets. I think which makes people win versus others not win. Right. But at the same time, if I'm making bets which are just purely incremental in nature, oh, Walmart stock, I think it may go up 10%. Right. What is my risk reward ratio there? My risk reward ratio is zero point 0.1. I'm investing $100 to be able to make 10% of it. Okay, so for every $1, I'm going to make only zero point 0.1.
Well, that's true, Ajay. I think that's where a lot of people are, for a lack of a better word, deluded by following the wrong indicators of the market, right? They're looking at what's the hot thing today, and they're trying to end up. At that point, they are either middle of the cycle or close to the end of the cycle. So I know for a long time there was this perception that if you follow all the politicians in the US, you know, Congress, and you would see their investments. But the fact is, those are self-declared investments. One. Second, and no politician is going to do it when the trade is hot. They're going to do it closer to the time when they want to exit the trade. And this is where I think people should be listening rather to the policy decisions that they are making rather than the investment that politicians are making. Because if they're going to tell you that they're going to do something this technology, it means they're looking to invest in.
Absolutely. Policy drives everything. Alvin, you're 100% right. I mean, what happens 10 years later, 20 years later, is all based on policy, right? UAE said no personal income taxes. Guess what? It starts slow and then it picks up. It's always a hockey stick, right? So if you take a hockey stick, and lay it down, and do not pick the Indian hockey stick, it's got a small, edge protruding out. Look at a Canadian hockey stick, put it down, and you will notice that it's a long thing with an edge going up, right? And that's what happens to everything in this world, right? Adoption follows a curve, and the curve usually is hockey stick. So, UAE said 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? Perhaps, maybe longer than that, that they're going to have zero income taxes. What happened slowly, slowly? Everybody who got rich in the world, whether in India or in Russia or wherever, after they got rich, they said, what is the place that my capital gets treated the best at? And they said UAE, right? Or hands down. I mean, zero personal taxes. So where did they move their capital and their money to? UAE, right?
Exactly.
So all of a sudden, you have a real estate boom here where simple flats are being sold at 100 million dirhams, which is about $30 million. Why is that? Because there's zero taxes, right? So everything has a cause and effect, and if we understand the implications of policy downhill, you understand what the effects would be, right? But everything's caused by policy, right? You go ahead and incentivize the farmers to grow more corn, what will happen, right? And if it's GMO corn, which has lower protein content and higher sugar content or higher carb content, people will get fat. They'll produce
Yeah.
more of it. They'll dump it cheaper in the market. People will consume it and people will get fat. So, you could pretty much look at a policy and say, this will be the ramifications of this policy. Okay, 30 years later, we'll have a lot of obese people. What can you do about it? Right? So your government comes in and says, we want everybody to get educated. Great, great. You want everybody to get educated. Okay. What is our method of doing that? We're gonna go ahead and give loans at 1%, right? And there's going to be no conditions, no caps or whatever, right? So what's going to happen? Very soon, Howard would have 100 fee, does not think that they're paying the fee because they think it's being financed by so you're going to have a lot of downhill consequences, which government does not look at when generating policy. Uh, perhaps because they don't care, perhaps because they can't. It's so complicated. But whatever the reason being, I think very few governments have the capability to look at such long-term downhill consequences. China had the one baby policy, right?
Yeah, that for
And
decades.
they had it for decades, right? What was the consequence of that, right? Now, you could balance it by having enough media talk about how girls are very successful too, but they did not, right? So people started selecting, they started killing girls in the stomach itself, right? And then
Yeah,
all of a sudden, they were just a lot more boys. In some rural areas, even today, the ratio of guys to girls is 21 to 1, right? For every eligible girl, there are 21 guys there, right? So, now what that does is it gives you a lot of factory workers,
yeah, absolutely true.
right? And potentially, and like I'm always very careful with my words because I don't want to put it out in the world because, like we all know that if the butterfly flaps its wings one side, right? And
The cycle on the other side.
yeah, so, uh, but where else could you use a lot of men is war, right? Now, if it
Yeah,
was Russia instead of China, they would have said, "Yippee, let's go to another few wars," right? Because World War II was won with, American steel, British
Russia.
intelligence, and Russian blood, right?
Exactly.
So
I think the funny thing with China's policy now is that's why today they've been pushing aggressively and actually rewarding people to have more kids, not just in terms of numbers, but also have more girls, right? Because now they've kind of caught up and said, oh, maybe we forgot account for cultural sensitivity. They were going from a simple economic perspective, but not the cultural aspect of their own culture.
exactly, I think they've done it right, though, right? Like India is going through a massive population explosion, and while I'm not saying that the government's not doing a great job, right? They're doing a great job, hands down. Modi is doing a phenomenal job, hands down, because everybody thinks India is just another regular country. It's not another regular country. It's like 50 countries put together. It's so goddamn difficult to manage. But where India ends up making a mistake versus China gets their act together is that India tries to take a tough approach, but really softens down on implementation, versus China takes a measured approach, but has very disciplined execution, right? So
That's
when that
true. A
whole
lot of times in China, you have a policy that becomes law, it's enforced. In India, the mindset is okay, you put up a law, I will find a way to beat you at your own game.
absolutely, absolutely, there's so much of bribery and corruption down to the bottomest level. Just two very quick stories to kind of get the point across. in China, there was this whole thing about gutter oil, right? Which was basically oil that the restaurants, so Chinese food uses a lot of oil, and all of that oil gets into drains, and Chinese restaurants are forced to put in a drainage system, a special drainage system, which actually has two different compartments, and then the oil, which basically comes up, as compared to water, can be siphoned off from there separately, and people will come and they'll collect this oil and they'll recycle this oil, not for human consumption, but for oiling machinery, for biodiesel, and for animal feed also.
Hmm.
Which I don't think it should go into animal feed, or at least the consequences should be studied, because if it goes into animal feed, then
It goes
it
up the
does
food
go
chain.
into it does get into the food chain, it does get into muscles, and to be able to get it there, there's a lot of chemicals that are used to then clean up the oil. So, but let's not get into that aspect, but just the fact that they found that a lot of that was getting back into human consumption. They were refining it, ultra refining it, and sending it back. So what started happening is it took a while for the government to they went in for crackdown. I think this was 2012 when they went in for crackdown. They were, 600 thousand tons of it seized right away. Police raids all over the country, and basically that entire operation was shut down, right? And then it came up with a very clear method of where restaurants can do and what they cannot do. And today, believe it or not, they export this recycled restaurant oil. The biggest importer of that is actually United States. So United States takes this gutter oil from China and imports it in the United States, and then extracts biodiesel, diesel, and animal feed byproducts out of that, right? So, so that's how China does, right? It took them a while to
I
understand
had
the
a bad
problem, to
joke when you
understand what to
said
do with
that.
it.
Sorry to cut you off. I just realized when you said America, imports all of this stuff. I was like, I know China made a lot of things in the world. I did not realize they made the garbage that America buys as well.
So it's got a purpose, right? It's cooking oil. It's cooking oil that got to your plate, because Chinese food has a lot of oil, and a lot of times, in North America you don't get it so oily, but in China you actually get the thing floating in oil. So you pick it up and you eat it, and the rest of the oil has to be thrown away. It cannot be recycled, right? So when it gets thrown
True.
away, then they have a special septic system in front of every restaurant which actually segregates that, and thereby it looks like it's gutter, and it is gutter, right? It's really dingy, dirty. That's all dishwasher fluid going there.
Mm-hmm.
Then the oil gets separated from there, and then that oil can be used to produce biodiesel, right? Which can be then burned in cars. So regardless, right? But the fact is, it can be used for biodiesel, which is a very good implementation of it, but it actually often gets refined enough that it gets sold back into frying oil. And some restaurants, unscrupulous ones, do tend to use it, and it gets injected into animal feed, so that it creates more calories for animals. Right. Now, that's Chinese implementation, right? Literally studied the whole problem, then went in with a swift implementation, shut down the whole illegal industry, set up legal parameters for the industry to flourish under. Okay? And today, as I said, a huge export goes to United States. Marriage and dowry is a big issue in India. Rapes are a big issue in India. And, over time, Indian government says, oh, I'm hearing a lot about it. Let me put some really strict laws around it. So firstly, they make really strict laws. But then what happens is the implementation of those laws is so far away from reality that there've been cases where a guy went to New Zealand, and 3 months later, somebody filed a FIR against that person saying he raped me today while that guy is sitting in New Zealand, and the officer has to write that FIR down. He cannot say no to that, even though he
Mm-hmm.
knows the person's not in the country. And leave aside being in a different house or a different part of the
He's
city,
in a different
you
continent.
different continent, right? So until unless there's some really key invention that we don't know of, which allows you to have sex across continents. It's just impossible for somebody to rape you. But then the way the laws are defined, the way the policy is defined is that the officer has to file a complaint. This complaint will then go through the process of getting this person deported from New Zealand to come attend trial in India, and that will be a 4 to 6 month process, right? And then after that, it'll take him 2 years to get that thrown out in court, right? So this person
Two
would
years,
technically 2 years
Ajay. This is
at
India
least.
we're talking about. Yeah, I would
No,
say
I mean,
more
I'm
than
giving
that.
you an optimistic scenario, right? So everything goes well to schedule. This guy would be in prison for 6 to 8 months, then he'll be bailed out. Then in about 2 years, come out, right? So, at the end of the day, policy should be about giving clarity to people. I, One of the things that I learned about, Sheikh Al Maktoum uh, about Dubai is that he said, what's good for business is good for Dubai, right? And I think policymakers need to get back to first and come up with these sayings that are relevant to them. And these sayings are just not for the fun of saying it. It becomes a mantra. It becomes a mantra based on which your organization moves, right? Google had this saying called "Don't be evil." So those taglines are very important for a country. Define who you are as a country. Define the policies, and define the policies that give people confidence. Another very, very big thing that I think India is completely lacking on, and not that we like to talk about India, we're Canadians, we like to talk about Canada, but just something that is so incredibly funny is only 3% of the entire government budget or revenue comes from income taxes.
That is very true. It is considered the lowest form of income for them.
But at the same time, I'm pretty sure more than that is paid in bribes in the income tax system,
Or that is
right?
definitely possible, given the way that, everybody wants a little bit of grease to keep the wheels running.
Yes. And fact of the matter is, largest investors in UAE are Indians. One of the largest amount of deposits in Swiss bank accounts, hidden deposits, is Indians,
Yes.
right? So what's happening because of that 3% is you're losing more than 10% of your valuation every year, right? So I think that's where policy, in my opinion, very, very critical, very, very critical to get your policy right and look at long-term consequences, right? Like if I was like if I was or anybody looked at it from a common sense perspective, they'll be like, oh, if I go ahead and eradicate income tax in India completely, no tax, right? Then nobody would have firstly, people will retain a lot more money. My economy will go up a lot because they will have a lot more spending power. Secondly, all the black market would disappear. Right now, you go buy a property and everybody says how much white and how much black. So that entire black segment will go away. Once that black segment goes away, all the crime related activities around them will go away. Right.
That's
So it's
true.
just
And that's a very unstated point that you just made, Ajay, right? That income tax means people have to find a way to hide their income, which in turn funds an entire sector of criminal activities on converting black to white, white to black, because people still want to spend their money. They still want to buy property in India, which funnels the entire sector to just operate in this gray space. And a lot of time that leads to other related crimes from uh, what do you call as forgeries to murder, all the way, right? It doesn't stop at just the black money being converted. It's not just financial fraud, because the whole criminal sector gets involved, and then you have things as crazy as murder as well going on, and it's just 3% of the income of the entire budget, which means
yeah.
it's not even in some countries. I'm guessing that percentage would be called a rounding error, right?
Exactly. Now, see, understand advanced economies like Canada and United States cannot get out of it, right?
Mm.
But that's where you need first principles thinking. You need to look at everything like Elon Musk looks at it and says, while those people need it because they can't run their governments without income tax, but we don't need it, right? So I'm talking Modi, right? So he could turn around and say, but I don't need it. And if I start thinking from first principles and I say, let's abolish it, right? Number one, my popularity would surge through the roof, right? Number two, spending power would surge, which means my GDP would surge. Number three, I could literally spend 3% less on policing. 3% of my entire revenue less on policing because crime would go down automatically. And I will have much better implementation of central bank digital currency because now people will not push to have cash on the side.
Very true. Very, very true. A lot of places, even now in India, in spite of the whole demonetization that they were in and pushing for digital currency, there is still insistence that cash be the way people get paid. And I'm not talking about your local street hawkers buying vegetables. No, I'm talking about people even buying vehicles and property, saying, how much can you give me in cash? And you know the answer that cash at that point is not white money. And
Yeah,
the
real estate has
banks,
the largest amount of black money in India. And it's crazy because then all of that money goes through Hawala channels and Arthias and like a lot of them are honest businessmen which are pushed into that trade because that trade is lucrative.
yes,
But
absolutely.
there's X amount of support of crime through that trade also, which we cannot deny.
Exactly. And like I was telling earlier, right? A lot of this is just the support system of crime that comes around because somebody is trying to reduce their income tax. But now they've actually changed the numbers. They've increased to about 12 lakhs as the tax cutoff, which is a substantially large percentage of the population that's going to be income tax, not be taxed for income tax. So I'm guessing this might start changing a bit. Who knows, next 5 years, they might actually go ahead and say, you know what, it's not worth the 3% for us any further. We're going to just abolish the whole concept.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. I think the current 12% thing, 12 lakh thing,
2 lakhs.
also has a significant disadvantage because then the moment you cross that threshold, you actually get much higher taxes. So, but maybe that's something that they can tweak further. But coming back to our core thing today of cycles. So, most people. The best way to see this is something that I remember where I was flying in this aircraft from Miami to Washington, D.C. And the guy sitting next to me said, "How did 2008 go for you?" Right? And this was right after the 2008 2009 crash, right? So I say, really horrible, right? Like I had significant property and I lost a lot of value there. I believe at this point, most of my property is underwater. But what that means underwater is that I owe more on it than it's worth to
Hmm.
the bank. And I'm like, how did it go for you? He's like, oh, we had 5 homes and we sold all of them. And so I was like, how did it happen that you sold all of them, right? Like what was the thinking? What made you? Because I was very curious. I wanted to know so that next time I don't get trapped into it. And he said, we as a church group, we would get together and we would discuss investments. And one day, while preaching at the church, the father said, "There's a time to sow and there's a time to reap." Right? And he
Yes.
said, at this point, he's telling everybody in that church to sell their real estate. Right? There's a time to sow and there's a time to reap. There's time for day and there's a time for night. So that was my first kind of shocked realization that there's a time for everything. So there's cycles. So it's best that we understand those cycles. And once we understand those cycles, we understand when is the East going to get power versus when is the West going to get power. Uh, you know, how does debt get created and how does debt get dissolved? How often does technology innovate? How often do real estate busts and booms happen? So there's a cycle to everything. And the cycle for real estate, very commonly known, is 30 years in United States. So every 30 years, there's going to be a boom followed by a bust. I way above my pay grade on why that happens. I think it's because of cheap money supply and all of that. But I know that that happens, and now I know how to use it to my advantage. And I know the telltale signs of when it's starting to happen, telltale signs of when to set, telltale signs of when to, when the crash has happened, when to buy. So I wouldn't say that I understand it from a very first principles perspective on why it gets originated. I almost feel like I'm a doctor which can not create a human being, but I can diagnose that this human being is sick or healthy and what to give to feed, and remove the sickness. So I only know to that level. I don't know how to create a
I think
human being.
most money managers are like that, Ajay. They are good at reading patterns and understanding these cycles, right? And a lot of times these factors are multi-layered, from simply the electoral's frustration of the particular political party to changes and leaps and bounds that's happening in technology. So earlier today you were talking about Nvidia and how they're talking about using chips for air robotics and stuff. In Europe, I think we've spoken about this some time back, they're working on bionic chips made from neural brain tissue, right? Which in turn has significantly cheaper costs than the silicon chips of today, not only in terms of production, but also in terms of their lifetime returns. And the fact that, unlike your silicon hardware, you can actually upgrade the biological hardware over the next few years, which means you are buying a brain, an AI brain for lack of a better word, and actually grow it and mold it as your requirements change, which means all of these factors, right? Technology changes, political changes. This is what a lot of people are often ignoring. They say, oh, I don't like politics. I'm not involved in it. I don't have an opinion. You might choose not to have an opinion, but it will have an opinion about how your life needs to operate. So it is best to understand these factors and work with them, right? If you don't, as you said, pay attention to policy, then you are not really leveraging the cycles that it's perpetuating.
Exactly. And coming back to these bionic chips, I think they're very valuable, right? Because a human brain consumes only 20 watts and does everything, versus an NVIDIA GPU consumes about 500,000 watts, right? Or a small cluster of it uses 500,000 watts to do the same thing. In fact, I would say to some extent a lot less than what a human brain does, because I'm listening at the same time and speaking at the same time. My body is running the heart and the organs at the same time. Everything requires computational power, right? Managing,
Absolutely.
balancing at the same time. So, even having an immune reaction at the same time. So, everything requires computation, and the body is providing a lot more computation at just 20 watts, versus that 500,000 watts is still not being able to do it. Why is that so? It's so because in case of chips, we have to store the weights separately in memory, then we bring the weights in, then we go ahead and do the processing out of that, and then we move it out. So everything is moving rapidly between transistors and memory, and so it's not very efficient. Now what happens in case of a brain is that every weight is stored on the thickness of the synapse between the neurons. So all you do is you know think of think of a brain like a ready-made kind of input output, right? You put a little bit of input from one side, almost like you're putting something through a piece of let's say foam, and it just percolates automatically from the other side. Right?
Exactly. I mean, it's basically millions of years of evolution versus what, 100 years of scientific research at this point in terms of how the chips and computer brains operate.
Exactly, exactly. Hopefully, down the line, we will have quantum brains that actually are storing these weights on the spin of the electrons, and thereby are much more minuscule, much more compact, and are three-dimensional in nature, right? The chips today have multiple layers, but every layer still operates pretty much as an independent layer by itself, versus something which could be atomic scale in nature can actually talk in three dimensions with each other.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see that, right? Because today the brain operates both fast and slow at the same time. It's got like millions of miles of thought processing that can do at the same time. Like you said, it's breathing, it's literally running an entire organic unit at the same time doing a lot of higher mind functions. Whereas today's best chipset is one track, right? But at the same time, when you look at its speeds per second in bytes, it's actually 10 bytes per second. It's not ridiculously fast, but it's able to do massive amount of combined computational processing at the same time. So I want to genuinely see how that changes the way programming is going to work in the next 5 years, how software development is going to work when you're actually working with an organic component rather than a silicon component.
Yeah, yeah, that'll be very interesting to see because the interface would require a lot of new technologies to be developed. But I think it'll be phenomenal because, as you rightly said, it's organic in nature, which means you can grow it, you can shrink it, you can retrain it based on the inputs. So yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be a really nice development. Now, coming back to government policy,
Mhm.
if the government decides that, oh no, after you put a million cells together, it actually becomes self-aware and thereby can feel the pain of the electrodes you touch to it, and you can do that research and blah and blah. Obviously, Europe will lose, and some other country which is
Actually,
better
the
and
reason it's
cleaner.
happening in Europe is because they have none of those rules. Whereas in the US, this kind of research, I'm not even talking about product building, is considered illegal. The way Europeans are looking at it is it's not made from fetus tissue. It's made from stem cells. Therefore, it's considered nothing more than like a organic prosthetic that's grown. I'm super
Yeah,
simplifying it, obviously, but it goes back to what you said, right? Policy, entire North America is restricted from working on this entire technology, which means European market and European companies will get first crack at it.
exactly. Exactly. I don't know, man. I don't know what these politicians at times are smoking, right? Like it's just like once you have to understand that you're on this planet for one and one purpose only, to understand the universe and be able to save your skin, save your ass before destruction happens. And destruction always happens, right? The way the solar system structured is that the pull of gravity is right in the center,
Yes.
right? And there are millions of rocks floating just outside Jupiter, right? And between Jupiter and Earth as well, right?
Ma-
So they're
Mars, right?
delicately
It's the Cooper
balanced.
belt.
It's a Kuiper belt, right? So there's belts of rocks, right? I'm oversimplifying it, right? But there's belts of rocks delicately balanced between Sun's gravity and Jupiter's gravity, right? And let's imagine that something goes between Jupiter and those belt of rocks, right? Now all of a
Okay.
sudden that puts a tug on those rocks, right? And then the moment that tug disappears, they bounce back with the sun's gravity, and then all of a sudden they start shooting towards Earth, right? So dinosaurs disappeared because an asteroid hit our planet, and there's just millions of these rocks that are dark in nature. We don't even see them. We don't even come to know till they come very close to Earth, and there's almost 100% probability that given enough time, they will get dislodged, and one of them would get dislodged, and they keep getting dislodged on a routine basis, right? One of them will get
Exactly.
dislodged and points right at Earth, right? So you basically, like, people don't see this on a daily basis, but imagine you are in a place where the bullets flying on a routine basis, right? Imagine you're sitting comfortably in your house on your sofa and the bullets going, right? Every 10 minutes, 15 minutes in evolutionary time frame, there's a bullet that goes through your house randomly somewhere, right? And you're like, I'm safe, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm sitting on the sofa, right? It's only a matter of time before you're walking to the washroom and one hits you right where it should, right?
Exactly. And to give a little more context to our listeners, right? The rocks that could cause an extinction level event on the Earth do not have to be huge. They just need to be the size of a building. So when you understand the scale of that, right? The Earth is massive. A building is minuscule in comparison, and something that small when it hits the surface of the Earth releases enough of energy to cause a massive climate change. And that's
Yes.
what ended up killing off the dinosaurs, right? It kind of made all the large body dinosaurs die off. The ones that turned to birds survived. And which is kind of funny, Ajay, when you're talking about asteroids, because they also work on a cycle, right? They're also revolving around the entire the stellar plane, and these constantly keep moving between the inner circle where the Earth orbits and what's where the Jupiter cycle is. And by understanding this today, NASA actually tracks millions of these objects every year precisely. And a lot of times they are able to do this because of mathematical models which are able to predict their entire cycle. And going back, which kind of fits with what we're talking today, right? And as we're reaching the end of our podcast, I think that's what a lot of people, I hope, take away from this, right? Understand the cycles in the industries and sectors that you're operating with. And some of the best way to do this is by looking at existing data, by looking at what your policymakers are talking about, whether they're doing it before they get elected, because that's a promise that they need to keep, or the minute they get elected, what are they spewing about? What are the industry leaders they're talking about? Are they having a massive conversation with someone from biotech and pharma? That means there's going to be an industry level investment the government's going to do, or there's going to be changes in trade regulations. A single meeting between some of the early leaders in Denmark led to Novo Nordisk at one point having more cash than the entire Danish government.
Yep, yep, yeah.
And
There's
that
so much
all came
capital
from
flowing around.
one drug.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, listen, starting in the 1750s, we had the Industrial Revolution, right? And this was the time steam engines, mechanization, all of that came in. And this is how cycles work, right? And these are major tech cycles, right? We say technology evolves and humans bring in new technology, which actually makes the other, older technology just depreciate. And all starts like it's a standard four-step process, right? It follows something like an S curve. So you have new disruptive innovation that comes in. You raise a lot of capital and you fuel that innovation, right? And this results in over investments, right? And then you have a bust that happens, but a new economic foundation is laid, right? Where this new technology now becomes mainstream. Eh, So
Absolutely.
industrial revolution happened 1750s to almost 1830s. Steam engines, mechanization, everything was getting mechanized, right? A lot of money was thrown into it. Then everybody realized, listen, we can use the same steam engines to run railways. So there was railway and steel and transportation and people moving and generating a lot of economic value. It resulted in a lot of debt being thrown at railways and a lot of that debt getting wiped off because it was unproductive in nature. And then we had the whole electricity revolution, right? Electrification also helped in chemistry. So, chemistry and electricity together, broadly say 1880s to about 1930s, right? Just at the edge of the most massive deflationary cycle of 1929. And then after that started the whole aspect of computing and telecommunications, right? The telegram, the computer chips, all of that, electronics, semiconductors, right? I would say that lasted till about 1980s, maybe 1990. And then from 1990 came the internet, right? And we realized that internet had huge potential. Some of them could see the potential, but everybody was throwing money at it. And then came the dot-com bust. So technology cycles and debt cycles are very intertwined with each other. Now we're looking at, I would say we're all reaping rewards of every cycle before us, right? We couldn't have built all the infrastructure had there not been so much of steel and railway available. Electricity was not available. Communications could not have taken off. If there was not enough semiconductors available, the whole internet era would have never arrived. But every era leads to overinvestment. Overinvestment leads to a bust, which makes the technology really cheap because you're buying it at pennies on the dollar after that, and it becomes mainstream. Everybody starts using it. Imagine if the dot-com bust would have never happened. MCI would perhaps still, there was a company called MCI, they would perhaps still own 80, 90% of the underwater fiber optic cables today,
Ah,
right?
okay.
And once they would own those amount of cables and they would have invested billions of dollars, they would have kept bandwidth fee pretty high up,
Mm, mm.
right? If they would have kept bandwidth fee very high up, you would not be operating your cell phone as much. There would perhaps not even be an Apple Touch cell phone because it requires a lot of data, and
Yes.
data would be very expensive, right? So I think every boom and bust cycle has this unique advantage that it takes something which is made expensive through unwise investments, through patents, through all of that, and then ends up selling it on pennies to the dollar after the bust cycle, and thereby making that stuff usable by everybody, right? So, you know,
So what you're
the
saying, Ajay, is that even the best of gatekeeping does not solve the concept of cycle. It'll bust through it at one point. So the idea is to be actually ahead of the curve so that when the dam breaks, you're right there to reap the rewards.
but what I'm saying is the best of gatekeepers would actually want a bust to happen. Because if the bust was to not happen, so let's look at it this way, right?
Mhm.
The cost of data in India is a mere fraction of the cost of data in Canada,
Yes, that's true.
right? Why? Because Canada kept a very controlled environment. The three players, TELUS, um,
Rogers.
Bell, and Rogers, right? And Rogers has such bad equipment or bad people, I don't know what it is. The only national network provider which was down for a full 24 hours. Never happened. Never heard, never dreamed of by any other country that that could happen. Right? But it happens in Canada. So Canada has one of the highest data pricing, mobile data pricing, lowest network coverage as a percentage of the country, right? All the drawbacks that you can think of. Why? Because the government kept good gatekeeping, right? Or as you
Mhm.
define as a white knight gatekeeping, right? So they kept a gatekeeping which was like, oh, let's not let anybody get bankrupt. Let's keep, you know, let's not let new entrants come in. Versus any other country which said X amount of people will go bankrupt, right? The question is not for us to save investors. The investors need to be smart enough to save themselves, right? Finally, we understand they're not the bottom part of the economic pyramid. They're the top of the economic pyramid, right? So let them save themselves by themselves, right? So they invest. Why? Because they're looking at a risk reward ratio like we look at, right? 1:100, 1:1,000.
Yes.
So if 50% of their deals go bankrupt, that's fine. They just need to make enough bets, and they need to be smart enough in terms of the bets that they're taking, right? So every country, every good gatekeeper, every good policy person, once they're creating a policy that says, I will prevent my companies from going bankrupt, is the worst policy in this universe. The best policy in this universe is, I will create such an abundant market that everybody would want to play in that market, and thereby they'll raise a lot of capital and play in that market. And I anticipate very well that 80% of them will go bankrupt, right? Only 20% would survive. But what will happen is, because of that competition, the best will come out, the best capital allocators, the best technology creators, right? And the best will win, the rest will fail. And if a capital allocator has made enough good quality bets, that capital allocator ends up winning the most at the end of the day, right? Because remember, what happens is, I do not, as a capital allocator, I do not win if I give Rogers my money. They're
Yes.
such poorly run, inefficient company. I can give them my money and I can go to those board meetings and I can try to push them. Nothing's going to happen, right? Absolutely nothing's going to happen. But at the same time, I know that China has 134 EV companies, and I know that 10 of them would survive, the rest of them will fail, right? I have better odds of making 100x there if I take my capital and I said I'm going to divide it into 30 people, and I'm going to give it to 30 of those companies, and I'm going to meet all of them and give the 30 companies that capital, and I know that 10 of them overall would succeed. So, being a reasonable person, having vetted the founders well, I think that one of my 30 would at least succeed. Right?
That's true. I mean, technically, the environment has become good enough that they can fail fast, and the ones that don't fail actually can thrive, rather than, for a lack of a better word, putting them on life support, right? Like that's one of the biggest challenge that the industry faces. There is this phrase, I'm sure everybody's heard it, too big to fail. That is not a positive sentence. It's anything a big hindrance because it's a white knight gatekeeping. I think, Ajay,
Exactly.
with that, we should probably come down to our closing remarks for this week's episode. I think this is what a lot of our listeners, I hope, are taking away from this, right? Do not read the news to predict capital. There are other indicators. Look at policy changes. Look at what the industry is going to do in the next cycle, or what's rather than following the current cycle, because that's where you end up losing money.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Always, always be forward looking. Don't drive your car in the rear, looking in the rear view mirror. And the next meter, right? You cannot drive a car looking at the next meter. You gotta look, 20 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet further.
Absolutely. And I think with that, thank you everybody for listening to today's episode. If you like our content, please like, subscribe, and follow us to keep abreast of the stuff that we're putting out.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your wonderful day. Bye for now.